Hello, everyone. Welcome to this beautiful sunny afternoon event here at CCSRE. My name is Anya Bushnell. I'm Interim Associate Director of Academic Programs here. And this event is part of our Faculty Research Fellows Program, which celebrates new work by Stanford faculty through a quarterly Chautauqua book salon. We're so honored to be here and to welcome Professor of Education Ann Charity Hudley. Before we begin, I have a land acknowledgement. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. We also wanted to make an announcement about our upcoming event. On May 19th, we have our faculty seminar series with Lerone Martin, director of the MLK Institute and professor of religious studies. Dr. Martin will be giving a talk on his forthcoming book entitled The Gospel.
Please slow down a little bit.
Oh,
Please
yes.
Please.
Thank you. On May 19th, we'll be welcoming Dr. Lerone Martin, the director of the MLK Institute and professor of religious studies. He will be giving a talk on his forthcoming book entitled The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, How the FBI Aided and Abetted White Christian Nationalism. And he'll be in conversation with Jennifer Burns from the History Department. Now I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Alfredo, our Director of Research.
Thank you, Annie. Good afternoon. My name is Alfredo Artiles. I'm a professor in the GSE and director of the Research Institute at CCSRE. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to today's event. We're grateful for your presence here today. We're thrilled to continue building on 25 years of excellence in research on race and ethnicity at CCSRE. Today's event is part of our Faculty Research Fellows Program, which celebrates new work by Stanford faculty through a quarterly Chautauqua book salon. Today, we're pleased to welcome you to our last Chautauqua of the year. We spotlight and celebrate the work of CCSRE affiliate faculty, Dr. Ann Charity Hudley. Dr. Hudley is a professor of education and professor of African American Studies and Linguistics by courtesy. She's also affiliated with the Symbolic Systems program. Dr. Hudley's scholarship addresses the relationship between language variation and educational practices and policies from preschool through graduate school. Her research has been funded by NIH, NSF, the Mellon Foundation, and the Ford Foundation, among others. She was recognized with a Public Engagement Award from the Society for Linguistic Anthropology and an award from the Linguistic Society of America. Dr. Hudley is the co-author of the Indispensable Guide to Undergraduate Research, as well as We Do Language, English Language Variation in the Secondary English Classroom, and Understanding English Language Variation in US Schools. Today, we spotlight Professor Hudley's fourth book titled Talking College, Making Space for Black Language Practices in Higher Education. The discussant for today's event is our dear friend and colleague, Professor Guadalupe Valdez. Dr. Valdez has a long history at Stanford and CCSRE. She's the Bonnie Katz Tenenbaum Professor of Education Emerita. Dr. Valdez studies the sociolinguistic processes of linguistic acquisition by learners in different circumstances. Those who set out to learn a second language in a formal school setting, which is described as elective bilingualism, and those who must learn two languages in order to adapt to immediate family-based or work-based communicative needs within an immigrant community, also known as circumstantial bilingualism. Her research in these areas has made her one of the most eminent experts on Spanish-English bilingualism in the United States. Guadalupe, thank you for your participation today. In a moment, Anne will join us to offer an overview of her book, then be joined by Guadalupe for a discussion. We invite you to join the conversation using the chat function to ask your questions. We will read those out when we get to the Q&A portion of the event. And with that, I would like to welcome Professor Ann Charity Hudley.
Thank you so much, everyone who is here today. I am excited
not just to give the overview, but to honestly have the conversation after as well. So many of you, I look forward to seeing you in person and having more conversations, as my time at Stanford now has almost been a year, if you can believe it. And this is my first book talk where the book is actually in hand. So you can see proof that it is now available. So I look forward to you all reading it and your feedback. I want to celebrate the entire Talking College project team that helped me with this text. And you can follow along with us on social media. And also we've been using the hashtag Talking College. So here are some more pictures of our team. They are amazing Black scholars, undergraduates, graduate students, faculty now as they transition on from graduate school. And they really range across the disciplines of education, African American studies, speech and hearing, and linguistics, gender and sexuality studies, and just bring all of their insights into this work and this project that's taken us years to kind of get right. And I have a particular lens today because this is where we are in thinking about the context of Talking College at private, really what we can call Ivy Plus or super elite universities. And so the work is really informed by my conversation with my colleagues, both here at Stanford, but across such universities, and really thinking about the linguistic, educational, and cultural experiences that Black students face across areas. And so I have pictures here today from my colleagues in linguistics and philosophy at MIT, and also Nelson Flores, my colleague at education, who really have been fundamental to this work, along with, as you see here, our colleagues Anita Ball and my colleagues at the Haas Center. I'll say right up front that the book uses a reparations model for linguistics, for education, and for the experiences of Black students overall. This is particularly important in linguistics because I want to directly recognize the material and intellectual profit that linguists as a discipline, but also as individuals, have benefited from the study of Black language and culture. And what we have directly addressed in the text is the reality that sometimes the success of Black linguists in particular can be punished as part of these systems of white supremacy and inequality that allow our language to be disembodied from our lived experiences and shared in ways that are both beneficial for then those scholars who do that work, but detrimental to Black people overall. We see this play out daily in general context for African Americans, and we're seeing it play out in live space and time right now within linguistics as a discipline. And so what I really want to focus on then is how do we make reparations something that's tangible? For me, that's really meant using a community-based participatory research methodology to work towards structural changes in higher education generally that are immediate in results. Most of my work has consisted around making educators and teachers who become policymakers and scholars, students who are able to become professors, and people who are truly attentive to community needs and culture, leading with the question, who do all of our students, but particularly who do our Black students and educators want to be? In the text, as we exemplify, but also in our work, in our practice, which the text is just the written representation of, we lay out ways to address inclusion. Traditionally, especially in spaces like this, what we really are building on are traditional STEM models. These are models and mandates set out by federal agencies such as the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and they actually directly funded this work. But the inclusion models really presume mostly an apprentice and assimilatory model of inclusion. That is, you learn how to do my science, my social science, my linguistics like I do it, and then you can become part of that community. We push past that with a partnership model and say that really inclusion has to be looking at working with neighboring disciplines and racial and ethnic and gender studies programs to create truly interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary models of inclusion. And that's why my conversation with all of us today is so important. Blasting past that, we argue, is a racial and cultural value model. This model emphasizes social justice and the intellectual values of scholars who are presently in linguistics and related areas from represented groups. And that's really where we see our text in the stream of inclusion models in the conversation. We don't shy away from direct address of white supremacy. And we think about this in the ways that students start to see this as they enter college campuses and how this conversation goes out throughout their experience, no matter what disciplines, majors they choose to focus on. It's often couched in pragmatic arguments in places like this about reputation, about expenses and majority wishes, right? So these conversations we hear about what is good education and what is a good experience for most people. But we set it back in the text and say, who has power in the academy? Or is that question more diffuse than we know? We make it specific. Who edits journals? Who runs organizations? Who decides on conference talks? Who awards the grants and donates the money? And how can the undergraduates and graduates who work with me understand those structures formatively to be part of them? And so we can ask together then, what kind of higher education do we want for the future and for our future students? And this is material for me here. We have more Black graduate students right now in the Stanford Grad School of Education than I've ever seen at any kind of university context like this. And every day it is my actual job to think about what will they do, what will their experience be, and where will they go next? And so I like my messy chart here because it puts me and my colleagues and my co-authors in this larger structure of thinking about the individual choices, but also the collective choices that we make. We are sitting in the situation where we have graduate students and new professors and super progressive educators out here researching and serving for justice. But we also have people who are vulnerable. And we know that Black faculty will always know that someone can always find issue with our work, pre-tenure and throughout our careers, and there can always be found something wrong. Super crucial to our model is faculty who are around us who are just happy to have a job and do what they do, right? We align this in our text with Martin Luther King's very moderate whites, who in many ways are the biggest challenge because you can go through your whole career and be successful and ignore all of the issues that we talk about in the text. And so our big question then is, how is discrimination and inappropriate behavior even handled in light of a very productive and also often self-serving lazy will for ignorance, embedded in people who have been forced away, right? All the threats, be careful, don't be like that person, or don't do that research. People who are really vested in thinking they're smart as part of that. And then we're sitting right on top of this liminal space of the power elite. These are faculty who are able to monetize their careers, make political decisions across constituents, and have reasons to defend their elite status. And this is super important for us to think about how Black students are seeing this and making sense of it, even in their first year as they go through their college experience, but really across their educational and their linguistic and cultural lifespan. So this text kind of continues this journey where we are focusing on pre-K through 12 experiences. We're looking at the undergraduate experience heavily, and now thinking about how do we make that space. So the conversation is definitely across the four texts, and it continues. We have 5 chapters in the book. We really lay out why these issues matter in the context of higher education and kind of talk about where a lot of this work has really been centered empirically and socially in a P12 environment. And then we run right down about how we see the linguistic work that has been done so far overlapping with Black studies, particularly as it's taught in US universities. Chapter 3 gives a full overview of what we mean by African American English, taking an idea of there's certain things that students really should have the opportunity to think about as they navigate their own experiences. And then chapter 4 is how we make that space, providing models and access and information to really have conversations between faculty, students, higher education staff, and professionals about how this space could be made. So that number 5, following in the great work of Gloria Ladson-Billings, our own students and those who read the text can be our next generation of linguistic dream keepers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the content. But before I do that, understand that the book is a work of practice. We brought together faculty and graduate students and undergraduates from UC Santa Barbara, where most of the text kind of happened, but also with historically Black colleges and universities around the country. We ran a summer program for 3 years at UCSB, and we'll be running the summer program here this summer, where we do the interviews and the ethnography and the findings that make up the empirical work of the text. That work was also coupled with a large multi-million-dollar project designed to reimagine how we educate students from underrepresented groups on the graduate level. And that's a National Science Foundation grant that says, hey, we need to really examine our pedagogical training, our faculty and career mentoring, so our students will be prepared for the universities that we're trying to create for the future. So as part of this work, we have been going linguistics department to linguistics department to help them think about how they contend with Black faculty and students, both at their university and in the world at large, and to say, look, we shouldn't just be following other areas of higher education. We need to be leaders in this conversation. To do this, we use a framework of deserving. This work is for Black college students directly. We say it over and over in the text. And the idea for us is to get your help and support in getting this information to students, regardless of their majors. This is a call for Black linguistic justice. And as one of our student participants, Maya Hayes from Norfolk State University, says to us over and over, imagine if a lot of us knew this, if we had this information so that we could make choices to preserve our voice, our integrity, and our dignity as part of our college experience. And so it's specific in answer. We are working to make undergraduate education more inclusive in particular. And we want our findings to be relevant and replicable, and they're real for us. These are some of my own nieces who attend Stanford, and I am watching them go through computer science classes, anthropology classes, even linguistics classes, and thinking about how this work makes sense to them and how they're making choices about their educational experience and their future careers and lives as part of the conversation. We rely and are so grateful for generations of work. In particular, I wanted to highlight today the National Council of Teachers of English Conference on College Composition and Communication. They funded this work, they have supported it, they have informed it, and we see it as a direct response to their 1972 Students' Right to Their Own Language affirmation. Stacey Pearman Clark, David Kirkland, Austin Jackson wrote a critical source book, and we really started thinking about this in terms of the direct motivation for the work on college campuses and broadening this conversation to different students and colleagues. So really the aspects to our model is the work is social science, it's humanistic, but it's pedagogy, it's dialogue, and it's partnership, right? And this is the model that I'm trying to set forth for our students to think about what will inclusion look like, not just on the campus, but in our research models. We're telling a story in the Black tradition, we're providing this empirical linguistic information, and we're directly addressing pedagogy, how this work can be taught as part of the process. So what do students need to know? We want more Black students to know that African American English, as our students say, is a thing. We want students to know what African American looks like when it's written, when it's signed, when it's heard, when it's embodied in our bodies. And we want them to think about, in a higher education context, how that then impacts a given curriculum or a given praxis. We want students to really get a sense of how language is their culture and how our Black is our beautiful. So that linguistic anthropology, sociolinguistics, Black aesthetics, all weave together in the ways that we tell this story in the backdrop of thinking about what culture is and helping students envision a larger model of their own cultural experiences where language plays a larger role in those daily conversations. We want students to understand that all languages have value and that their language isn't broken, and neither are them. So many times in higher education contexts, even if we say it, the students aren't feeling it and they're not experiencing it. And so how to make sense of that is a large part of the conversation. We also want students to understand that their lived linguistic experiences make up a lot of modern linguistic theory, not just sociolinguistic theory, but the ways that we think about how languages vary, how they change. Our insights come from African American language and culture and lots of research. So we highlight specific large areas of inquiry, including examinations of the ways that consonants vary in words. We think about the ways that social and cultural identification and intersectionality have played a way in the way that we think about how language change happens over time. We want them to feel that scholarship and that contribution as part of the text. And we want students to understand what is one of my favorite concepts, which is mutual intelligibility. The idea that we are all may consider ourselves speaking English, African American language and culture, and we can understand each other across that continuum. But different people take different assumptions when it comes to what they understand and how. So we're understanding each other, but it's to varying degrees. Even when I'm giving this talk today, I have a sense of what I want to convey, but how you hear it based on your identity, your background, your lived experience, even your disciplinary perspectives really can change that information. So helping students think about that differences in production and perception of language are part of this. And they're part of this that they can control, but there's parts of those that they have to anticipate are going to just vary. So why, the biggest question, do we still use African American language and culture in higher ed context? And what we argue is that in addition to all the racial, cultural, value, and social aspects, we're preserving meaning. We're preserving our meaning specific to linguistics, but our broad meaning, our meaning for being here and our meaning for doing what we do. So we think of this in a sense as a scholarship of dissemination and thinking about how we share information about what we value, why this is important, not just giving it as a sense of dry linguistic facts. That takes us right into the tie in the book between language, culture, and Black activism, and helping students think about their rhetorical and linguistic strategies and the impact that their own communication has on the ways that they can change their human experience. We do that with the context of you're Black, don't have to look or sound like mine, and that these are open research questions, so that the research hasn't really fully reflected the range and the richness of the Black linguistic experience. And so we really have an invitation in for students to read and contribute and tell us where it's different for them or where they have a different perspective, because that's what the research really, really needs. We then turn to really thinking about how all of this impacts Black college students' experiences. Where do we hear ourselves and see ourselves in the work? So to do that, we just built a dissemination model. The idea with the model is that when students get to college, they find new freedoms in some aspects of how college is set up and how they are experiencing their own identity and their own sense of Blackness. But their peers also bring up a whole new set of positive, negative, and neutral social constructs and social pressures. And so over the course of my career and all of our team's experiences, we've seen how students try to make sense of that. And we wanted to just have some specific models that they can use in real time. So this is our language and racial identity development model. And the whole idea of the model is that it's not fixed. I may feel these different ways within a certain day or within an hour. I may feel them in context, who I'm talking with, or my experience at a certain moment. And all of that also intersects with the linguistic experience that I'm having in that moment. And so the fluidity of this, again, is super important so that students can add their own nuance. There are students who speak African American English, and they're still grappling with standardized English, and they know it, right? And that's part of what they're dealing and reckoning with in the college context. We have students who speak African American English and are what we call unbothered. And they go on in great detail in thinking about how they got that way or how they think about that in the text. We have students who are amazing users of African American English, and they're amazing at standardized English. And we profile the conscious and unconscious realities that students in that category have, especially at universities like Stanford. We have students who speak standardized English and speak some African American English or understand it. And so we look at African American language and culture from a heritage language and culture experience as well. And we have students who speak standardized English and they know African American English, but they ain't really trying to admit it. And they may not be trying to admit it for many different reasons. This may be something they've learned to do. They may not know the linguistic information, but this may be also their identity and social stance, that all English is what comes out of their mouth. And so these differentiations are not helpful for them. And we really talk about that reality and that choice in the text. And then we have students who speak standardized English and don't know African American English, and they kind of talk about that experience as well. So Doza, who I think is on the Zoom today, made this visual representation that appears in the text. And they really did a great job, I think, of showing that this is not a linear path. It's not one that you would learn, and as you acquire more information about Black culture or linguistics, your ideas may change. But no, this is something that we're grappling with and we're going to grapple with as Black people. But the conversations that we have and the ways that we think about this can be moved and changed with more information. And so I'll just give you an example of the text has great examples from the students themselves. And our undergraduates and our graduate students were amazing interviewers of students in their own communities and students in making new connections. But this is one I particularly like, and it really gives a sense of the flavor of the text. This is for a student who speaks African American English and is unbothered. The student is proud of their language and their culture, and they're often oppositional to dominant structures. And they realize in the Black tradition, college is often about getting your paper. And by paper, we mean your diploma and the money that you're gonna earn after college. It ain't about assimilation to a dominant norm. And so in students in this category, they often describe their sense of Blackness, both lived and collectively, as pretty pronounced. So the student says, is this someone who believes in the politics of academia, or someone who believes this is gonna change my life, or this is gonna help the world? You know what I'm saying? These kind of students who are invested in the politics of academia in its fullest sense. Yes, if I were that person, I would say yes. I have to do what I have to do to change how I speak or how I look or whatever. But they're gonna treat me like an M regardless. So I might as well ask, I'm sorry. They're gonna treat me like a Black regardless. So it's just like, why do the most? I'm literally sitting here having to like shove myself into a box, and for what? Like they're gonna see my bald head and they're gonna be like, look at this bee. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't matter. To me personally, like that's just what I think in high school. I tried to do this for like a year, and then I realized it didn't make a difference, at least in my experience. When the interviewer prompted and asked a little bit more about, well, how are you dealing with this in writing in college? The student says, well, when I write essays, do I write grammatically correct? Sure. But you know what I'm saying, right? So the student really is indicating they're onto this game and onto these choices, but just really seeing the ways that they're navigating is what we're looking at here. And this is from a student at a predominantly white institution in the Southeastern United States. Highlight a little bit of chapter 5, just to kind of show you the different lens that we have there. We take on directly the topic of the scholarship of teaching and learning of Black students. And I've been heavily involved for years in the scholarship of teaching and learning and the high impact practices community in higher education, especially for undergraduates in my previous capacities as directors of undergraduate research. And it always struck me there hadn't been a direct conversation in that group about Black students and thinking about what values come from Black studies and from the historically Black tradition, both at historically Black colleges and universities, but also at predominantly white universities that lay out some frameworks for us as faculty. So we did that in chapter 5. I think about my job as a faculty member for the last 20 years. And my job really is to compel my students to dream bigger than the current limits of educational and linguistic white supremacy. That is to say, we are imagining what our research would look like far before our disciplines and our departments and the courses reflect those realities. My job is to make sure my students aren't grateful for crumbs that are a result of current higher education practices. We resist quite heavily I'm happy or lucky or grateful to be here model and understand gratitude, but understand it in the sense of reparations and the sense of duty, and earned and lived experience. My job is to center their Blackness at all times in their research and allow and make space for that. And my job is absolutely to center them in the experience in the academy overall. To do this with a model in linguistics, what we are really working on quite actively building out from chapter 5 is the notion of liberatory linguistics. This is linguistics that is designed for people from marginalized and racialized communities that is expressly focused on liberating their forms of communication, expression, and humanizing our connections, even in scholarly spaces. One of the ways we're trying to do this very actively is with a big push for co-authoring and partnerships as students work in different, and scholars work in different linguistic communities. And if you can't do that, having really explicit discussions about why, right? And so the idea of some of these larger ideas that we all have held traditionally, get to those conversations about the aspiration, but also the pragmatics of the practice. We do this by example with our writing project, and this is written up in the text, but it also is a standalone website that really gives educators an online guide for writing. How can you start implementing this, regardless of your discipline, your area, or your background, in conversation with Black students? We have specific examples about how to grade and comment on African American language and culture in student papers in ways that are culturally sustaining. How to explain writing and grade back approaches, and how can this be informed by instructor knowledge of K-12 writing experiences. So we provide sample graded papers, sample rubrics, and examples of African American language and English across genres. The guide for students allows them to have language and examples of how to advocate for that right to their own writing, and gives them examples of different situations they may find themselves in, and again provides examples of this across genres, so across disciplines and majors. So this is just an example, and the link there is srtow.org. The site is very infographic in nature, so you can click on different topics, including like, oh, I want to ask my professor about why they gave me this feedback. Let me just click on this. And it gives students a good graphic sense of linguistic flexibility and what that could look like. So it's easy to kind of just pull up on your phone, be in a writing conference or review where once you get a paper back and kind of have that conversation. So this is where the book leads. It leads into these practical, usable aspects of how we can change our pedagogy to be Black sustaining and informed when we may not be scholars of Black studies or linguistics or any of that on the daily basis. So academia is really just beginning to fully describe the African American experience. And so we want to be in conversation with all of you all. And it's been really informative to think about this across areas, disciplines, institutions. And for linguistics, we are really in this conversation of how do we really linguistically manifest this concept that Black lives matter. So I want to really thank all of the teams of students. You can see them across my different courses on African American language and culture, and all the research teams, and then all of the supporters of this work, because I feel like in many ways this text is a culmination, not just of this particular NSF and UC project, but of all the different projects and conversations that I've had across my career, and that's taken a lot of support and a lot of funding. So I will stop there so that we have plenty of time for questions, and you all can put them in the chat or Q&A, however we want to do it. And I love to stop screen for that. So I will stop now.
Well, Anne, this is absolutely wonderful. I'm so delighted and honored to be a person engaged in this discussion with you. I must tell you, I just applaud your work. It's something like every page I found myself clapping and saying, this is absolutely wonderful. I'm so glad she did this. We really needed this. So I want to just engage you a little bit in your thinking about this. I want you to tell us just a little bit about, you started with terminology, I noticed.
Mhm.
In your first chapter, you were very, very precise before you did anything else talking about terminology. Could you say something more about that?
Yeah, I not only just I, but the whole team really felt like one of the challenges that students face in this context of mutual intelligibility is that they're not really sure what we're talking about. So a lot of our researchers just say, well, what is this Black English or this African American language that you're talking about? Is it what I'm doing or not? And it's really important up front to give students some common starting point to what we mean. What does it mean to be Black? When we say Black, who are we including, right? These types of conversations that in many student experiences can actually kind of be not necessarily overlooked, but not directly addressed in their curriculum. So we wanted to give students a place to have that, whether or not this is something that's specific or not. And it's personal to me. Like I think about, I got all the way through my career, and I took lots of Black studies courses, lots of linguistics and sociolinguistics courses in education. And I never wrote an essay just about what is Blackness? What does Blackness mean to me? How do I think about Blackness? How do I think about myself as a Black person? So some of that terminology is really designed to encourage that larger, I don't see it as existential, I see it as practical reality that then we can take into our scholarship.
Thank you. I think that was very, very effective. The other thing I was very struck by is that whole notion of linguistic autobiography.
Yeah.
And you have students do that. Could you tell us more about that?
So my dissertation advisor, William LeBeouf, really popularized the context of the linguistic autobiography for several perspectives. One is to really show our common and our varied linguistic landscapes, the experiences across our lives that inform the ways that we talk. And the idea is that, yes, we can measure this acoustically and we can do all kinds of visual analysis, but there is still at the heart of that the importance of your own story and your own decision making and laying out that rationale. And why I love it so much, in addition to those reasons, is that it aligns so greatly with two other traditions of autobiography. One is the Black cultural tradition of autobiography and biography and story making and counter story making as a way that we navigate, particularly in learning spaces, but also thinking about the importance of reflexivity, memoir, and narrative in an educational context. So understanding how what you've learned and what you've seen informs who you are as a student, but also as an educator. And when you tell your story, you really masterfully get to blend those two. So I can be telling you about my language experience, and that can be informing the language policy and the teaching that we do in a classroom, but also for the US or the world.
Thank you for that. So would you say a little bit more as you thought about putting this together with your authors, your co-authors, and I love the co-authors that you had, and possibly if our audience doesn't know much about them, could you say just a little bit about them and how you came to work with them?
Yeah, so I came to start working with Christine Mallinson years ago when we came out of two big sociolinguistic labs. I worked with Bill LeBeouf, Christine worked with Walt Wolfram. We were finishing up our dissertations and like really had amazing opportunities, but both decided, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna go back down south and work in the dirty. Really work at regional. I was at William & Mary, she was at UMBC, strong, well-known universities for Black student achievement. At the time, of course, you may know about the Meyerhoff program, so Christine was working really closely as part of that community. And William & Mary at the time had the highest relative graduation rate for any public university. And this is our home. Christine and I, our families come from the same small hometown in North Carolina. And we're like, let's just give it a shot. Let's see what we can do to make the situation better. We added into that team Mary Buckholz, who comes from Tulsa, Oklahoma, went to Booker T. Washington High School, right, post-integration, and thinking about the legacy of all of the horrors, but also the triumphs that we know in Oklahoma. And so our intention of making a cross-racial, post-Southern, in that we are really thinking about this, in the places that we move to and then come back to across the country, conversation that is informed by traditional ideas about how we can model cross-racial, cross-cultural conversations in service of Black students. So the team is practical. I do a lot of the talking and drafting at the front. Christine comes in next and adds a lot of the the literature and kind of framing out, because her degree is in sociology and mine's in linguistics. And then Mary comes in with the anthropological lens, and as our senior scholar, often does the final editing. So this book in particular was a split. We did about, it wasn't quite 50-50. So Christine and I did about 40% of the work, and then Mary kind of did about 10, but it is a collective effort because all of our students that we learned and work with are part of the text. And so that's how you get to the author team.
Right, and I'm sure you anticipate my last question, which is, what about white faculty? What can they learn? And what about Black faculty who come from a multilingual background who might not have any experience in this country working with Black populations? So what's the next step for you?
I think, white faculty still make up the majority of faculty everywhere. And so this important idea of thinking about how Black students move through the universities, but also through their learning spaces, is super important for us to have conversations. So reading the text and then having conversations with us, but also being in a situation where you're learning with the text for students is important. So we really intentionally set up these dialogues in each chapter. Take some of that burden, that Black tax or whatever way you want to call it, off of the student so that the faculty can really position themselves as learners of Black language and culture. And we think this is really important for Black faculty to do as well for a couple of different reasons. We look at historically who has been privy and who've had access to information of Black language and culture. And many Black faculty haven't necessarily taken those classes because of the history of historical racism, not just in higher ed, but in linguistics. And so we're acknowledging that this learning experience is kind of mutual because of that history, but that those faculty are the experts in navigating and making decisions about how to be successful as scholars and writers. So it's really destabilizing who has the expertise as a way of being more open about decision-making rather than just kind of linguistic knowledge or linguistic myths. And this is kind of where our work goes forward. So we are now heavily engaged in interviewing at least 100 Black faculty about their own linguistic histories, their decision-making, and how they've navigated the Black language and culture through higher ed. So if you're in this video and you haven't been interviewed yet, know that we will probably be reaching out to you in the next couple of years for those interviews. So Talking Faculty is segueing directly into, Talking College is segueing directly into Talking Faculty. And we're collecting that informed by some amazing memoirs. I see Geneva Smitherman's on the call. Her memoir, John Rickford's memoir, an article that Tracy Connor did reflecting on the life of John Ball. We've got Lorenzo Dow Turner's amazing biography by Margaret Wade Lewis, and other texts that really help see how scholars themselves are problematizing and operationalizing some of the research that you'll see in Talking College.
I can hardly wait to get that book as well. And maybe the very last comment, because I know you've been posting a little bit about this. You have a strong belief in liberatory linguistics and the discipline of linguistics itself. Could you comment just a little bit in parting about where you are right now on that thought?
I think Jamal Muakil, one of my doctoral students at UCSD, who was on the call, and our former UC regent, who has a long view of this, said it best. Linguistics should be a space that Black people run to, where we are describing the everyday nuances. We're measuring it, we're doing historiographic lenses. Why is that not so, right? And so thinking about what it will take, whether it be in linguistics departments or in other areas and spaces, for this to become something that's super popular, because we know that it is. We can see it on social media. We can see it in the interest of Black people talking about how our language and culture kind of evolves on a daily basis. And so for liberatory linguistics, for me, is the idea that Black people will be free, working, learning, taking classes in these linguistics, applied linguistics, educational linguistics places as a way of expressing our humanity. And that's going to change the questions that are asked in these areas. It's going to change the way that linguistics and the study of language, I think, is viewed in higher ed. That's what liberation for us means. It's really practical. It's when all these students are faculty and they're driving research agendas and they're creating texts that are informed by what we've done, but taking it so much further.
And are you getting pushbacks on that a whole reparations perspective?
Every day. So I get pushback on this word constantly, and it comes in many directions. I mean, some of the most harsh criticisms are this is not what we should be focusing on as Black scholars. We got other axes to grind in terms of what people see should be forefronted in progress. So people are asking, well, why he focus on language? I mean, economics, policy, administration, all these other issues, why language? But I think if you start losing the Black self, then we've already lost the battle. So that's one major pushback that I deal with a lot. Another pushback that I deal with a lot in the liberatory linguistics concept and is just what is linguistics? What should we be doing as linguists? What should the research questions and methodologies be? And there are many linguists who are just ardently opposed to this humanistic social science approach to linguistics and approach to agenda setting that is broad across education and ethnic studies, and just disregard it as linguistics, but actively fight against it, actively see it as detrimental to linguistics as a discipline, detrimental to the ways that linguistics has been able to survive in particular schools and universities, and also linguistics relationships with funding agencies. The great irony of all of that is that I definitely at points in my career said, you know what, I don't care. I'll do what I need to do, even if you don't agree, but I'm still here. That's the only thing, I'm still here. I've never not been funded. I'm funded by the agencies that they were so afraid of. And so we have to look at, again, where that pragmatic fear and racism against a broader notion of linguistics meets people's individual agendas, because it plays out in what Black students are able to access on the introductory level in linguistics courses. And if you want to hear more about that, we're talking all about it on Monday at UC San Diego's Department of Linguistics.
And perhaps someone could post where we might be able to join that conversation, or at least eavesdrop on the conversation. That would be very, very, very helpful. So I'll let you do that, and then I'll come back to the statement on race that you were such a part of. And one of the things that I'm very struck by that statement on race, and maybe you could tell our audience a little bit something about that, and then you conclude with a statement about what about the tools that the discipline of linguistics has given us, and how it might have contributed to the issues that we face, the lack of understanding, and so on. So
I was still at William & Mary when I had the great honor of being nominated and elected to the Linguistic Society of America's Executive Committee. So I was thinking very strategically about how I wanted to use my time and energy in that organizational space. And the Linguistic Society of America is kind of the largest cross area organization for linguists. And I, being, informed by my Southern experience, had the great pleasure of being in the same public university system with scholars such as Audrey Smedley, and scholars that have really laid out what the study of race looked like in anthropology. So that's kind of where I got my informed for it. And then Christine was coming from sociology and seeing the statements in sociology. We're teaching across these disciplines, and said, you know what, we got to kind of bring linguistics up to speed on some of these larger conversations. So we just decided to take the plunge, use my time there to kind of inform people about it and get the statement done in a very community-based manner. And as we're doing that, we just got so much testimony, so many scholarly, responses. You can read all of those in language about the ways that racism, both structural, systemic, personalized, mediated, and internalized, which is always the trickiest one, have kind of happened in general with language, but also in linguistics as a discipline. So the push for linguistic science is important. I value it, otherwise I wouldn't still be in that NSF space. But the discursive and rhetoric strategies to push out other forms of study of language and other ways of thinking about this has really played into where we are, with a focus on disembodied empiricism being seen as more important in linguistics, but not really seen in the context of our economy, right? So what was really going on is students are maybe thinking they're just doing some linguistic problem, but those in power were really using that information and that data to inform places like Facebook and Google. And so helping our students see like what looks esoteric and random is not really esoteric and random, but really does inform where they're entering the conversation. So it's not that we don't value those places and spaces, but it's having a real honest conversation about some of these questions that we have now about AI and computational and machine learning models. They actually need to be informed by social linguistics and social theory. And so this detour of disembodiment has actually gotten us in a situation where we meet these challenges, but now we need large numbers of Black linguists at places like Stanford, because I need my students working in those places and spaces to deal with that history. So helping them understand how that came to be helps them be able to be those scholars and researchers that we need to address it.
And do you think you're making progress, that that's being received well in the discipline?
Well, when you start getting good old pushback like you got on my Twitter right now, you know you're making some progress. But I think the tangible progress that I see is this next round of Black scholars who are studying language and moving into large research spaces where they will be able to, people have always been somewhat in those spaces, but we've got a whole crew of Black students going into these flagship universities, places where they'll be able to have doctoral students and ask these questions on a big platform, in addition to our scholars that we are so actively now in conversation with at HBCUs and other universities. And so we're destabilizing the model of where this happens and how.
Well, thank you. Then to conclude, what would be the last words that you would say to our audience about the book in our discussion before you get questions from the larger audience?
I would say read the book if you have time, but look at the website if you don't, and share that with your students. It's free. And I think in many ways, super important to think about how do we break this down into practical chunks, as Black students are living through pandemic and protest, and they need the support immediately and expressly. That's kind of who I am as a person.
Wonderful. So I know that Annie is going to join us and start looking at the questions that we have.
Sure.
So I will then shut my video away and make sure that Annie is with us.
I am with you. Thank you so much for this tremendously rich discussion. I love that you've made this work accessible via website and that you let us know that it's available, that it's digestible. All right, now I get to turn to all of you in the audience. It is time to make your presence known. You can drop a question in the chat and I'll be happy to voice it.
Yeah, there's some in the chat already. I don't know if you want to pick.
Oh, are they? Oh, yeah. Okay, great. So I'll do the latest one. This is one of the best talks I've been to at Stanford. Thank you, Dr. Charity Hudley, for the work you do. In addition to the concrete suggestions you have for classroom contexts, e.g. for teachers, faculty, etc., how might you suggest people in university administration and staff settings do a better job understanding how narrowly normative and reproducing of white supremacy are the default linguistic practices?
Yeah, I think part of this is we've got to be in those spaces as well. And so moving into administration, supporting the scholars that are there. Shalom Gooden is the Vice Chancellor for Research for Social Science and Humanities for the University of Pittsburgh. Tracy Weldon just got named the Dean of Graduate Studies at South Carolina. As linguists kind of move into those larger university-wide positions, and my work obviously is informed by the administrative positions I had, especially as Director of Undergrad Research for UCSB, we have to really look at the budgetary and mission kind of statements and power. So Jamal's really lens on kind of thinking about the UC regents and what their priorities and values are. We have to do that homework. I would say, unfortunately, to really think about then what to highlight with administrators, right? So when I go in and I work with provosts or deans or whoever is helping lead these mandates, I gotta be specific, to the point, show the data, show the information, show the impact, definitely include student and faculty narrative, but I've got to order everything, as we say back down south, I got to order my steps really carefully. And so I think to help to see that in many ways is to see the impact on the experience of Black students. How is this impacting not just their academic achievement and not being forced in that, but their whole being? As we move to thinking about social emotional wellness and mental health for Black students, how does always speaking and changing who you are and what you are tax that on a daily basis? And I think that conversation, because it's getting more attention, is one that I've been emphasizing way over just achievement. I've always been myself as a student and a faculty member in high achieving spaces. So I really try to get away from that conversation into what we're learning and how, and to what purpose and what end.
Thank you. Here's a question from Shelley Fisher-Fishkin. She writes, thank you for a fascinating discussion. I wonder whether the role that Black language played in shaping the art of a white writer like Mark Twain can play a role in your efforts to validate the vitality of Black English. For example, it was a story a formerly enslaved woman told Twain in her own voice that led to Twain's first contribution to the Atlantic Monthly, a true story repeated word for word as I heard it, and was a key step on the road to Twain's writing Huck Finn, the book from which Hemingway said all modern American literature came. Ralph Ellison told me in an interview that, quote, Mark Twain helped many of us find our own voices, end quote, and he agreed that Twain's attentive listening to Black voices likely played a big part in that. I explore these issues in my book, Was Huck Black? Mark Twain and African American Voices. I look forward to reading your book.
Well, thank you for that question and comment. So I spent most of my professional life in the English department. And so my second book, We Do Language, which is a direct quote from Toni Morrison's Noble Address, takes on the issue of the literary aspects of how this, the African American language and culture has kind of not just been taken up by white authors, but how the written literary tradition of this work informs what we think and what we know about African American language and culture. So I take the Twain example, which is just laid actually out in our text as well, as an example, is to think about, well, what elements of Black language and culture did Twain and those who informed Twain kind of emphasize? How did Twain receive those? And then what comes out in the written text? And thinking about that as a subset of the fuller range of how Black language and culture manifests and how it's expressed gets us really thinking about that literary tradition within Black literary tradition and then across US literature. So I look forward to reading your book as well as we kind of think about what Blackness can be represented on that page. And we take a lens of thinking about this in terms of I dialect, so the ways that Black language is even represented and how that informs perspective and linguistic and literary analysis of that, but also then how those texts are taught and interpreted and understood by different students as part of rounding out, what that literary experience is. So there's a lot of testimony in the text of educators teaching it and thinking about how they're going to grapple with that larger context of language and culture, and then also students talking about their own experiences reading the text. So I think that kind of gives us that sociolinguistic lens on how Twain and others, we do Twain, we do Harper Lee, we do Zora Neale Hurston, and we take a couple of authors on in a larger kind of literary study in there.
Thanks. All right, there's room for more questions in the chat, so keep them coming. But I'll take advantage of my my privilege as the kind of moderator here to ask a question, which is, I was so struck that you said that that you knew that you were making progress because you were getting pushback, right? Pushback as a litmus test for progress. And I was thinking about the toll that might take on you as a researcher, and if you had any kind of words about how to make this work sustainable as researchers and how to cultivate resiliency.
I think that's a great question. I think there's a couple of things that really help me sustain resiliency. Is not just seeing the challenges, but seeing the successes and having really strategic plan and metrics for those successes is number one. So it's like every time you get an L or a challenge, you get a win. And then also for me, doing the work very collectively. I think that to me is the key. There's different ways that people enjoy being scholars. I enjoy being a scholar in a very active, collective way, even in the Zoom times of lots of research meetings, lots of co-authoring, lots of sitting in the Google Doc together, writing, lots of collective editing. It gets the collective isolation away from scholarship, but also it really involves how we do these issues. So when a challenge comes up, I'm not alone. I've got tons of friends who are thinking about these issues and looking at what we're doing, and understanding that we're part of an ongoing multi-generational, multinational struggle for Black dignity in life. And if you don't have to directly take that on, but if you do that, you know, there's lots of people who are in that working service with you. So that's kind of how I think about it. And then I get lots of sleep, take lots of breaks, and do things like we did in my lab yesterday, where we had a counselor, a Black therapist and counselor and social worker come with us and work on grounding and understanding our values and understanding how this work is still connected to who we are and the lives that we have has been super important. So taking a holistic approach to my own life, to my own scholarship, and how I interact with students is super important.
All right, we have a question from Professor Valdez. Would you like to come back in and ask it, or?
Sure.
I can.
You go ahead.
Okay, the question is, can you highlight some features of Black English for people not familiar with it? And can you talk about how it is misunderstood?
Absolutely. So I will just give you a rundown of some general overview. So I always start with lexicon because it's tangible and it's real. So when you think about, well, what is the Black lexicon? So there's things that we know come historically from Black language and culture, and then the lexicon splits from there. So things that are identifiably Black in history and nature. So things like jazz, gumbo, right? Historical things that come from Black Southern traditions. There's also the new words. So this is why I say stump the panel. Things that are part of Black culture that general mainstream white Americans may not even be using yet, or may not use in general context. So think about the lexicon. You can think about all kinds of words that I may know or use that other people don't. So a classic one that I use a lot myself, because it's an absolutely normal word for me to use, but other people may not know, are body related, right? So there's the kitchen, there's a part in the back of your hair that, I don't know, my hair is straightened out by the immunotherapies I take, but the back part is still not there. And so I think about that as the kitchen. Another one for body parts, right? If you're just thinking about the ways that you describe your body, maybe what is a trunk? So there's trunk, for some people maybe the torso, but for other people is your hind parts, right? So those are just body related lexical variation. We then move into sounds. So African American language and culture has different varietal phonological contours, particularly at the end of words, but also some at the beginning. So there's much more variety in the use of stops, D, instead of interdental fricatives. So you might hear students say this instead of this, and they may alternate, right? So it's not like one way or the other, it's a variation situation. Same things at the end of words, much higher frequency. All Americans have what we call consonant cluster variation at the end, but African Americans may have that variation more. So that final consonant cluster may be realized as either not produced, or it may be a variation. So we might have a word that like best, where we might hear best and best from any American, but we may have a greater frequency of African Americans saying best. I'll give you one grammatical just to kind of round out the ideas there in that sense. Different variations in our grammatical system. One that's been highly emphasized in the literature is the copula. So this is not necessarily the verb to be in like a general sense, but it kind of gives the sense of meaning in different ways for different people for a state of being. So if I say, oh, wow, he came to my Zoom lecture, say, he's in my Zoom lecture. An African-American person could say, he in my Zoom lecture, right? So thinking about that alternation there, again, not static and fixed, but most white Americans would still add he's in my Zoom lecture, where Black people may say he in my Zoom lecture, either all the time or sometimes. And then there's a lot of Black language and culture that's not the specific phonological, grammatical, lexical, but it's the discourse. It's how we tell our stories. It's how I give this talk, what I choose to emphasize and highlight, the tone, the pitch, the amplitude of my voice, how I move my body, right? All of those different aspects are also in Black language and culture. So one of the things that is really important in the educational context is Black storytelling. We may start the story at the beginning, but we may start in the middle more, or we may give you a dramatic kind of opening, and I may not follow a chronological linear progression in my story, which is often viewed as concise, crisp writing or storytelling in academic spaces. I may tell you all kinds of stuff. Like I may give you evaluations like this happened to me. But let me tell you what my husband thought about it. And then I called my sister and my sister was like, did that really happen to you yesterday? Right. So it's bringing in that fuller sense of dialogic and community, even as we express and relay information. And then it's understanding all the ways that this values across the Black experience. So the way I do this in my Black Southern tradition and as a now 5-year Californian is going to sound different than my students here in California who may be from LA, different parts of LA, they'll take that to the hilt. But it's also looking at the ways that this interacts with other varieties of Black languages through the Caribbean, South America, Africa, right? And understanding some of the similarities in cultural practices and customs. And that example for me, I love is a movie called The Language You Cry In, and show how maybe your linguistic patterns were lost in slavery, like the details of your consonants or your grammar. But the ways that we mourn, the ways that we do rituals have real direct links to Black people throughout the diaspora. How I cook. I grew up as a rice eater myself. My mom's parents were from South Carolina, so rice was our default. Understanding our practices and how we prepare our food and how we live our lives, that part of Black language and culture, I think, is really important, and it needs to be described just as much as kind of something about consonants or vowels.
Oh my gosh, so much to take in. Other questions from the audience? Now is your chance. Here's a question. Can you say a little bit more, please, about your upcoming work? What can we look forward to next?
Absolutely. I'll put the video for y'all in the chat. It's a good one to watch. So we now have a new National Science Foundation grant from the Build and Broaden Fund, which is designed to have universities partner with researchers at minority serving institutions. So we have this amazing team of scholars from community colleges, Research One type universities, historically Black universities, small liberal arts colleges. We got everybody on the team. And part of it is to document our linguistic experiences, but part of it is for us to meet monthly and to really start research agendas, say, what are people working on? What kind of information do we value? And so that group right now is engaged in a new text of Talking Faculty, just laying out some of the basic information that we share, but we can't really find as much in the literature. So rounding out the linguistic autobiography aspects, and then moving into the reality that many of us were hired on what are known as target of opportunity hires. And there's lots of paperwork about how that works in different places and even some literature. But what we're focusing on there is, what does it mean as a Black faculty member to live your life as a target of opportunity hire? So to say, what are the material experiences that designation and that experience from hire to promotion and tenure and forth mean? And how do people talk about you? How do they interact with you? We're doing the logistics of being hired somewhere. We just talk about what does it mean to start off somewhere as a Black faculty member and kind of make your community and make your scholarly and personal community. And then we look really specifically at our linguistic choices within that landscape. So that's our kind of academic-y chapter. And then chapter 5 is about moving into promotion and leadership. How do you, once you're fully tenured and promoted, and you maybe have academic and administrative responsibilities, what choices are you making in that stage of your career? So that's what we're working on actively and aggressively right now. And we are also finishing 2 edited collections. It's the Oxford Collection in Inclusion and Linguistics and the Oxford Collection in Decolonizing Linguistics. This is an international conversation with papers from 40 teams of scholars, because most of them are not single authors, teams of people writing about issues from all different perspectives, from pedagogy, praxis, research, their lived experiences along those themes of inclusion and decolonizing linguistics. So right now we're just like editing the final papers, writing the inclusion and decolonization intros, and getting ready for that to go off to Oxford. So that's been a feat of work in the last couple of years. So we're happy to kind of see that rounding out. That's our 2 like large projects right now. in addition to like our everyday work. We always keep an active, really Black historical centered line of research, which is directly with educators. So we have 3 webinars coming up with the American Federation of Teachers. I'll see if I can find those. And what we're doing with that is just providing information that even comes right from what I talked to today, in ways that educators can get continuing education credit, which is super important for in-service educators. We're doing one on the linguistic autobiography. We're doing one on bringing, right now in schools, you get a lot of what's called equity audits, and they're not just an audit to assess, but they really are conversations about how equity is playing out in a particular space. And then we're doing one on using poetry to teach language variation. So that gets back to those questions about authorship and literary approaches. So I just put the link to those webinars in the chat, and we're working on getting those done. And there'll be a big article that comes out from the American Federation of Teachers next summer that goes along with the webinars.
Amazing projects. Those sound like some heavy lifts. You're juggling a lot.
We got amazing teams. I am heavily indebted to not just my undergrad and grad students, but this amazing crew of assistant professors, not just here at Stanford, but across the country, who really keep this work going.
Here's a question from Perlita Dicochea. She asks, are there gender differences that are relevant to your work and to students' experiences?
There are gender differences, there are intersectional gender differences, there's trans approaches in our text, thanks to many of the scholars on our team. And we're actually even just thinking about, re-problematizing how gender differences have been analyzed in linguistics, right? Which has kind of been a binary, Black women do this, Black men do that. So not saying that that's not like important, but re-examining how do we do that when our more current models of gender being more fluid. So we take an identity approach rather than this descriptive, disembodied approach and say, like, what are Black women saying about what does it mean to speak and think about Black language? What are trans students? How do they identify and thinking about how gender and race and language and culture play a role for them? So to do this in a way to kind of redo not just the text, but the methodology, we're taking that approach. And so you'll see that reflected in the text, and you'll see that reflected in the work that our students are putting out to kind of continue that conversation forward. And I think that's super important as we go forward, is to not just kind of go, well, this is what Black men do, this is what Black women do, even though, we're pressing up against some of that strong, I have a strong socialized identity of being a Black woman, but understanding that that conversation is in progress of what that means in new generation. There's a question here.
Yeah, there's a question here from Joseph Hill, also along intersectional lines, asking, is there a place to interrogate the relationship between race and disability in a sociolinguistic context? I'm thinking about the time when there was an assumption that Black children were speaking incorrectly, when in fact they used AAE, African American English. Also, there's a lack of awareness about a variation in ASL, American Sign Language, including the variety that is used by Black deaf people since 1867, but this variety hadn't received much attention until the 2010s, when the Black ASL research became known to the public. This is due to ideology of disability, where much of the work is hidden.
So I think there's not this huge space, but we have to think here in particular in the difference between sentiment and skill, which I think is important in general. But the real questions of, even if I value a student who identifies as Black and may identify as having a disability, what is my real ability, my real knowledge that I need to have to really give that student the support and the education that they deserve? And so I think there's a huge place of interrogation in that space. I think we don't even have the right assessment for many Black students to be adequately linguistically assessed in written, spoken, or signed form. They just don't exist. So there's a whole body of research that needs to go down there. And then there needs to be a lot more work out, even among Black educators, in thinking about how they approach not just their practices with students who are disabled, but their whole idea and contextualization, which is to say that, Black survival historically has had an interesting relationship with disability. I argue that it comes all the way back from times where the Black body wasn't valued if it wasn't seen as strong and able. And we've internalized some of those messages in ways that I think we still need to address within the Black community. And I thought about that so much as I myself became disabled and as I myself started to lose my hearing, how much I have to advocate on a daily basis for those practices. And I'll just go ahead and give you a shout out there, Joseph, that I've learned so much from you. That's not just become general, but that's become specific. I was thinking about you yesterday. I didn't know if you're coming today. When I was in my latest hearing appointment, just seeing how much more of my hearing has gone away and how much we can learn from your experiences and the work that you've done that really needs to get into K-12 education and higher education praxis. So that is not just what we do in linguistics, but what do all faculty need to know to be able to support students and to support our colleagues. And that is huge. And my nieces are here in ASL courses because I got them going. But I was like, take this information from Professor Hill to your instructor. And if you're not learning about Black ASL right now, you need to be, because this is something that, we're advocating for on the ground. But that extra layer of daily assertion, my goodness, if I didn't have you and other scholars showing me how that looked, I'd have been so much worse off in the last couple of years. So I just think there's so much we need to do, and even documenting those experiences. I mean, I'm fully remote this year and making sure that I can access everything that I need to and be a part of the Stanford community as part of that. Even that has been huge. And thinking about how we do that as Black people when our existence in these places is already kind of challenged and contested. I actually, if students are going to interview me and kind of get that down on paper.
Well, you also kind of anticipated this question, but Janine Smitherman asks, can liberatory linguistics be implemented on the K-12 level?
I think, I hope so, and I think so, and I definitely think, if not me, some of our students should go back to our earlier work and revise it and update it from that lens. And I think what it will really do in that liberatory linguistics framework is recenter Black educators and Black students as experts and as knowledge bases, and having the experience just by what they're doing on the daily to answer some of these big questions that are coming to the forefront of every educator's mind right now. Not that they weren't there, but they're new. I mean, I come from places where talking about race right now is being contested in ways that hasn't been since the 1960s. My colleagues are calling me, texting me, trying to get advice about what to do, both in schools, but also in schools of education. And I think now more than ever, we need to take a direct liberatory framework to help them through these periods where people are actively and directly trying to incite fear of talking about these issues, fear of talking about race, fear of talking even specifically about how to support Black students. I don't see how we're going to do that any other way besides emboldening people with a liberatory model. And that's going to come from university and school partnerships. It's going to come from all of us giving educators specific pedagogical and linguistic information that they need to teach, but also to confront and have these conversations. That's something part of what we're doing in those AFT webinars is providing those models.
I'll ask another question. You speak a lot to the kind of the pedagogical work that we need to do. Can you speak to strategies of resistance that Black students have employed and continue to employ today?
Absolutely. My thing is pedagogy is my resistance. When my Black students know how to teach each other about these issues, when they can inform people about approaches, even social movement approaches, the ways that we have staged and organized across communities and across schools. That's when I say pedagogy, that's what I mean. I don't just mean curriculum or what somebody did in the classroom. I'm talking about larger community, like porous models of education across traditional definitions of what is academic, what is scholarly, what is school even. And that's why I focus on pedagogy, because I come from a Black upper middle class to upper class, depending on who you ask, background. And my lens on all of that is I have had access across my whole life to neighborhoods, communities, spaces, and schools that many Black people have not. Just structurally, formatively, we have not. And so my job is to share that information, to share a model of resource rather than rank with people, and to think about our pedagogy going in all directions as being what I'm learning, what I need to be working on is being informed by greater questions from Black scholars and Black students, rather than me setting some kind of scholarly agenda and saying, because I'm at Stanford, this is what we do. So that's why pedagogy, liberatory linguistics all go together to me, because it really destabilizes our centers of knowledge, but also what we should be learning, and understanding the material sacrifice in that, sacrifice to individuals' safety, sacrifice to reputation, sacrifice to kind of how you might want your life or career to go, in service of learning, learning how to do this better, learning what we could do more collectively rather than individually, following assimilatory models. So that's what I mean when I say pedagogy. So this is the first time I've been fully in a school of education, but I think the pedagogical model in the ethnic studies and the Black studies, African American studies lens, has always been there, but I think we can now kind of double down and assert that can be a high value in what we do.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing discussion. We're so grateful to you for being here, and also to Professor Valdez for being your respondent. If there's not any one last comment, I'll give it like 5 seconds.
That's all good.
I think it's all still landing. Yeah. Well, thank you again, Dr. Hudley. We so appreciate your being here. And thanks to everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, y'all. If you have individual questions or want to chat, I'm happy to do so. These webinars are so can't even see you all, but
yeah.
I am happy to hop on Zoom and have conversations. And I really appreciate your time and energy here as we get through the spring quarter, which is always real. So thank you.
See the way he walks into the room and then he speaks. So sweet, every word from his lips is like honey. I know he loves me. Hear the way he sings and the way he strums his instrument, the way he jams and the way he treats his family. He's funny. I know he loves me. Although our life's been super complicated, just play this song when you need a little lift, 'cause baby, I'm finally